Good evening and welcome to a special edition of Conservative Corner. I say special edition because it really is, in that this is the first time we have had an additional show in a given month, I believe ever. And the reason why we're doing this is because we are in crisis mode. And when I say we, I mean the conservative Jewish community, or rather the Jewish community in general. And the crisis is, and it continues to be, the rising anti-Semitism in America and the effect that it's having on college campuses, filtering down into the high schools, the junior highs, and in the society at large. Luckily, as we see it, and as polls have indicated, 80% of the adult population of America is still very pro-Israel. However, on the college campuses and in the high schools, that plummets dramatically. The question is why? And we have our own theories pertaining to that. And rather than delve into the theories pertaining to that, we have to really find out what we can do about it instead of sitting around and holding hands and lamenting. And that's not what we're here to do tonight. We're here to talk about what is happening, what has happened, and what will continue to happen if we don't really get a handle on it. What you have been seeing on the college campuses primarily is an anti-Israel, anti-American movement. And the two go hand in hand, where one is anti-Israel, one is anti-American. Now, we had naively assumed that in our garden city of Newton, which is about has a population of 1/3 Jews, that we would be, shall we say, exempt or immune from that because of the fact of the demographics that are in our district. But that was not to be the case. And we received a rude awakening about 3 weeks ago when we were told that there was essentially, and I don't want to use the word pro-Palestinian, I'm going to use the word pro-Hamas because it was and is a pro-Hamas exhibit at the Newton Library. Now, there's a lot of finger pointing and hand wrangling as to how, why, and who got that in there. But the fact is that it's there, and it was shocking to the community. And many of us initially saw the art exhibit, and I remember going in to see it. It was actually a photographic exhibit as to what the authors conclude was the terrible Nakba, they call it, which they say was the annihilation of and the expulsion of Arabs during the 1948 Israel War for Independence, and how horrible the Jews of Israel have been to them ever since. Now, of course, what happened in 1948 was very simple. The year prior to that, the United Nations partitioned that area of the Middle East between the river to the sea, the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea, an Arab state and a Jewish state. The Jews accepted it, the Arabs did not. 5 Arab countries surrounding it, Egypt, Syria, et cetera, Jordan, invaded the young Jewish state to try to extinguish it and push the Jews into the sea. And they lost. And as a result, Israel acquired more territory and has really been dealing with that problem of it being under assault by both within the country and other Arab nations for now a 75-year period. But nevertheless, that's history, and unfortunately, it's a history which many of these students who are protesting don't know and refuse to know and learn. Now, what essentially happened when they had opening night at the library for this pro-Hamas exhibit, many of us who went there with the understanding that this is a no place for hate city. We are not going to tolerate this in our midst. We don't want to have a dialogue with these people who brought this event and this pro-Hamas propaganda event. We don't want to sit down and hold hands and have a kumbaya moment with them. No, we want to shut them down and we want them out of our city. And we succeeded in doing that. And I was very pleasantly surprised at the vociferousness of the organized community that was there. And these were people of all walks of life from the Jewish community. They were liberals, conservatives, people who I know are very academically inclined, people who, I knew one fellow who drove a bus and others who just are very working class, whatever. And there were a few gay Jews interspersed among them. But the point is the Jewish community is unified in combating this pro-Hamas anti-Semitism in the country and in the community. Now, we had seen it so many times in universities and elsewhere across America. UCLA, Columbia, Brooklyn, Chicago, you name it, it's happened. Normally what happens is the Jews are overwhelmed by these Israel and Jew haters, and they're the ones who have to retreat and are coward. This time, the roles were completely reversed, and the pro-Hamas crowd was shocked that we fought back, we pointed at them, and they're the ones who fled the building. Literally, they fled the building, which was, and we were really surprised. But I have to say, I'm very proud of my colleagues for initiating that and for having the fortitude to do that. And to talk about that and to talk about where we are, and I think it's very important. We've had him here before a few times, and he's really the go-to person in the Boston area for all things pertaining to this anti-Israel, really anti-Semitic movement, which has been unfortunately coalescing and mustering in our area as well. And that, of course, is Jake Donnelly, the campus activism for the Israel-American Alliance. And Jake, it's a pleasure to see you here again. And you do such wonderful work, and you've been involved in so many of our counterpunches against the radical Hamas terrorist-loving crowd that's been out there at some of the most distinguished universities in the country, if not the world. And for example, at MIT and Harvard, what has been happening there is really an absolute disgrace. And it's an embarrassment to our country, and it's an embarrassment to those of us who are from and who have lived here for many years in the Boston area. And as an example, at MIT, the #1 technical university in the world, there was a huge pro-Hamas encampment there. And you and your colleagues organized and mustered a huge counter-protest against them, and it was very effective. And you had many people from students, high school students, to older people, including, if I may say, the producers in the studio here. And you launched an effective counterstroke against them, and I believe that MIT has taken down its encampment. Harvard is a challenge by anyone's estimation, and it still has to be dealt with, and we're going to be dealing with it. And so I'll let you, please, if you would, I've talked enough about this, and I could for a very long time, but I will turn the microphone over to you and tell us, just take the lead and elaborate on what's happening and what needs to be done.
So the main thing that we're really concerned about at the Israeli-American Council is that A in our Israeli-American Council name, and that is American. And you said it before. This isn't just anti-Jewish, it's not just anti-Israel. This is anti-American. What we're seeing on college and university campuses, on high school campuses, that is what we're most concerned about. It's why Iranian Americans are showing up to our events now. These people understand what horrible, tyrannical governments are capable of. And when they see people that are getting their civil rights trampled upon, which is exactly what's happening to Jewish and or Israeli American students at college and university campuses, they know that that's not right. And that's what you saw at the Newton Library. A fact that the Newton Library was putting on a propagandistic display. A display that was so one-sided, and yes, it is good. And I even have the actual letter of what is said outside of the Newton Library. Notice on the wall outside the photo exhibit an opposite 24-book poster that you can go and see right now at the Newton Library, where it says, the Newton Free Library strongly believes the importance of providing multiple viewpoints to facilitate understanding of complicated topics such as the war in the Middle East. And this is complicated. The Middle East conflict is very complicated, but what's happening right now is not complicated at all. This is good versus evil. This is terrorism versus a country that provides equal rights for all of its citizens. Not just Jews and Israelis like me and your lovely, much better half, but people that are Druze, Christian, Muslim, Armenian. Everybody has full rights if they are a citizen in Israel. And yet, when you go to the library right now, they are putting at a place of prominence books that just completely lie and obfuscate things that are historical facts. So when you go to page 238 of the 100 Years' War on Palestine, written by Rashid Khalidi in the 100 Years' War, very telling. On page 238, when we're talking about how the 5 Arab armies, when Israel declared its independence and the 5 Arab armies attacked Israel, according to this author, the provision for an Arab state in the 1947 partition resolution, and then in parentheses, albeit never implemented, Jimmy Carter's, and then it goes on. Never implemented. Not just never implemented, rejected by the 5 Arab states. Rejected by everybody. And you said Nakba, the catastrophe? Up until recently, everybody knew what the catastrophe was, what the Nakba was. That was the fact that they rejected the partition. That was the fact that they decided to try to finish what Hitler started in World War II, in the Holocaust, and then they lost. And this country, America, has kind of lost its way. We used to believe in personal responsibility. We used to believe in agency. But because we no longer do, now somebody can say, I started a war with 4 of my friends, and we all lost. But now, even though we started this war, we instigated it, we rejected the plan that would allow us to have a state of our own, that is the catastrophe. Not that 750,000 or 800,000 Arab Muslims who are living in the British Mandate of Palestine, not that they were either expelled or fled of their own accord, but the catastrophe is that they lost. That is the catastrophe. But if you go right now to the Newton Library, you're not going to learn that if you read this book. What you're going to learn is indoctrination, not education.
Well, what they're trying to do at the library, and obviously these are very left-wing progressives who are trying to manipulate what books they show and trying to manipulate the public and trying to have this moral relativism where you have the position of Israel and the position of so-called Palestine. But you know, there is no equilibrium between the two of them, in the sense that one side is right and one side is wrong. In World War II, there was a right side and there was a wrong side. And what has happened now, in particular, this past year, since October 7th, is you had basically the descendants of the German Nazis and their allies in the Middle East staging what amounted to was beyond a pogrom, but really a mini Holocaust in southern Israel from the Gaza Strip, where these a terrorist army, without provocation, just infiltrated Israel in massive numbers and murdered, brutalized, raped the population. And we're talking about putting babies in ovens, killing children in front of their parents, desecrating and raping and mutilating bodies, and ripping people apart while they were alive. Jews, primarily, but also the Christians, Filipinos, and Thai workers.
Thai workers, yep.
Exactly. Sorry. And so this was an atrocity that they committed, even though they had their, if not a state, they had their, shall we say, city-state.
Self-governed.
Self-governed in Gaza, which was independent, which Israel had nothing to do with and had no sovereignty over since 2005. And this was an enclave of 2 million people, which, when they were given sovereignty of that, and Israel withdrew, they could have turned it into a Singapore, a Hong Kong, but they chose not to. They chose to turn it into a terrorist state, and they built up their terrorist infrastructure for the one moment that they could eventually strike at Israel. And they did, and they did it to great effect. And we've been dealing with it ever since, and in large part because there are still 130 hostages there, several of whom are Americans, and the president, the current president and his government refuse to do anything about it, to try to mitigate it or solve the problem. And they're actually adding fuel to the fire, in that I think that you saw this really pathetic display of actually the U.S. military or Army Corps of Engineers trying to put in a pier into Gaza. and to bring in supplies to them. So I would love to be at one of these press conferences if I could get credentials and just ask the president's press secretary, during World War II, did the Americans bring in or allow humanitarian aid to be dropped into Germany at the height of World War II? Did they try to build piers into Bremen or Hamburg in northern Germany to facilitate supplies? No. What did they do? They bombed them into oblivion, because that's what you do with Nazis and people who are similar to them, similar to today with Hamas. And that's what we're essentially doing, or rather not doing, in trying to alleviate this conflict. The best thing for the U.S. to do would be to just step aside, let Israel do what they can to deal with this problem. And just as the Americans did what they had to do in Afghanistan and Iraq for a period of time. And this interference on the part of the Biden administration and their horrendous Secretary of State, Mr. Blinken, is really unconscionable. And hopefully there'll be a change in administrations this November which will rectify the problem and get things on the right course. But what's mind-boggling is that with what's happening on the college campuses, and you see all these mindless students walking around, and they come from some of the best institutions in America. We've all seen it. And they constantly shout, from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. Well, when you ask them which river, which sea, they can't even tell you that. They don't have a clue what's going on. And what they also don't seem to realize, from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. Well, that's Israel. So what you're saying is you want the annihilation and the disappearance of the Jewish state. So you want to have a second Holocaust. You want the elimination of all Jews there, and for it to be Palestine, a 23rd Arab state in the Middle East and North Africa. And they don't have an answer for that. They don't even want to think about it because they just don't think. And again, these are people from some of the most prestigious universities in America. We always thought, or it was assumed by our liberal counterparts, that the threat of anti-Semitism and neo-Nazis would come from the far right. The high school dropouts from the Midwest and from Idaho and places like that. Well, those people, if they exist at all, they're so minute, they're just so trivial, they're irrelevant. And in reality, the real threat has come from the intelligentsia in the universities with the college students and the professors. And and we've seen this before in history, and we saw this with for example, the Cultural Revolution in China in the 1960s. We saw it with the advent of the Communist Revolution in Russia, in St. Petersburg and Moscow in the earlier part of the 20th century. And most important, we saw this with the universities in Germany in the 1930s, in Munich and Heidelberg and elsewhere. And this is the trend that's happening now. And the question is not so much that it exists. We know that it exists, and we know that it's festering and continuing. The question is, what can we do about it? And it's hard really to snuff out this movement. But what we can do is simply to get a backbone, to have the community, the American community, Christians, Jews, and everyone's in between, get a backbone, stand up to these people and say, you will not do this, we will not put up with this, we're going to stand up for our community, for our schools, and we don't want you in our community, we don't want to have your presentation, we don't want anything to do with you. And there's an old show, a movie that was on many years ago, long before you were born, and where the announcer gets in front of the camera and says, we're mad as hell and we're not going to take it anymore. And that's the critical mass that has been reached. Now, about a month ago, 3 weeks ago maybe, there was a massive pro-Israel demonstration in Boston behind Temple Israel. At least 2,000 people showed up. And these are people from all walks of life. I actually saw people with rainbow flags, gay flags with the Magen David in between, and we saw right wing, left wing, and everyone in between. So the Jewish community is unified. And what we're seeing on the campuses as well is people are starting to get a backbone and fight back against them. For example, North Carolina State, when the pro-Hamas people tried to take down the big
UNC,
American flag,
yes.
UNC,
yeah.
and Yeah, and they took down the massive flag, and a fraternity, I think, of mostly Jewish, but not all students, went there and protected the flag. And they were pelted with bottles, they were pelted with everything, but they wouldn't back down. They stood their ground, and they got admiration and accolades from all over the country. We have to see more of that. We have to see people getting angry. We have to see young students getting angry, whether they're 13 or 14 or whether they're 64, like some of these people were at the Newton Library. I saw one young lady who couldn't have been any older than 18 getting in the face of these keffiyeh-wearing, terrorist-loving people and basically intimidating them just like they intimidate us, you know, with her righteous anger. And we can't let them get away with anything. For example, I received comments and alerted calls from parents and students today pertaining to some things that are happening at Newton South, and I'll alert you to one of them, and that is that students are wearing keffiyehs around Newton South. So I sent a message to the school, to the principal, and I said, they're wearing keffiyehs. To many Jews, this can be extremely offensive. I said something to that effect. And this would be akin to allowing students to wear Ku Klux Klan masks in the schools, which would be very offensive to blacks. So in other words, you allow them to wear the pro-terrorist keffiyehs, but you won't let students wear the Klan attire. And I said to her, please explain to me the contradiction. Obviously she didn't, because she didn't get back to me, because it is a contradiction. She doesn't have an answer for it. But that's what we're dealing with, and my point is that we cannot give them an inch anymore. You cannot dismiss or just, you know, look the other way. You have to face it head on, because once you do, they back down. Once you do, if you show courage, if you show a backbone, they will wilt, because we have, with our righteous anger, we have right on our side, and we have to turn into might.
To me, that's the most important part. You said it right at the end. We have right on our side. A lot of people like to dismiss this as something more grandiose than right versus wrong. It is not. What we're fighting right now is the same war that we have been fighting for thousands of years. It's why it's so important to really appreciate your Jewish values. It's why it's so important to appreciate American values and to understand that American values are Jewish values. Freedom of religion, property rights, the end of slavery. You can find all of that in what I call the Tanakh, what other people will call the Old Testament, the Bible. You can find all of that there. You read the Founding Fathers. These guys loved the Old Testament. The most oft-cited book by the Founding Fathers is the Old Testament. It is the Bible. All of the ideas that made this country the greatest country in the world, the freest country in the world, where you can, with nothing to your name, come across our borders legally as an immigrant and then make something of yourself. So that Nigerian immigrants are some of the most, they make the most money. Asian immigrants. We are the country of immigrants. We are the country of Americans. We are the country of people that love freedom. But freedom requires a backbone. But to get a backbone and to be so certain of what it is that makes you who you are, which in our case is Americans, in order for you to get to that point, you need to understand right from wrong. Because you're not going to be able to, if it's just me and you shouting at 100 people, how do we know that we're in the right if those 100 people are telling us we're wrong? It's because we know who we are. We understand our values. We know what is right and what is wrong. And all it takes is a backbone. It takes power. It takes courage. And we're seeing that from not just the Jewish American community or the Israeli American community, but Americans that don't necessarily have a dog in the fight beyond they understand that this is anti-American. And the more people that can say that, the quicker we will get rid of these people that don't just hate Jews, they don't just hate Israelis, they hate America. And I am the son of a Vietnam Marine tanker who went there along with a bunch of his buddies and said, I know what I'm doing is right. I've never been to Vietnam before, but I know that I need to stand up for what is right. And gonna pull back the language that was just about to come out as the son of a Vietnam Marine tanker, but he know to his dying day that he needs to stand for this country because this country stands for freedom.
What you'll notice at the pro-Hamas rallies is they have their Hamas flag, but there's never any American flags. Now, this was demonstrated at the library when the event was shut down, and then they all went to the outside, the pro-Hamas people. They went across the street. There were about 100 of them demonstrating with their flags, and we were across the street on the other side, the library side, with Israel and American flags. We had two of them together, and because it is a pro-Israel and it is a pro-American movement, and there have been, I'm sure you've heard this around high schools in the area where principals and administrators will say, well, we have to have consideration for the Palestinian students. And so my response to that is, no, you don't. Because in 1940, for example, we had German students at Newton High School and at Brookline High School. And this is even before World War II. I'm talking about the Battle of Britain era. And, you know, and at the time, there were two distinct camps. One was right, the Allies, and one was wrong, the Germans. So we don't have to have any moral relativism for the Palestinian students. They're wrong. The pro-American, pro-Israel students are right. There's no ambiguity in this. There's no gray area. The Palestinian students, they're supporting the pro-terrorist, pro-Nazi Hamas. They're supporting them. And what they did on October 7th to the Jews and to the other Christian workers who were there, they're supporting them. We're trying to destroy them for doing that. That's really it. Just as happened prior to, or during and prior to World War II. And another quick example. Again, 1940, before the U.S. entered the war, the German Bund, the German-American Bund, was very active in the New York City, New Jersey area. Those are basically social groups, support groups for Hitler's Nazi Germany. They're very active in the area. And so the Jews, many of the Jewish activists in the area got tired of just sitting around letting them do it. So what would they do? They would go in to where they had their beer halls, and they basically bust them up with baseball bats. And then the German Bund would move to a different area, then they bust them up as well. Now, I'm not saying we should go with baseball bats, but what I'm saying is we have to confront them nonetheless, because the situations are similar. We have 2 minutes. I'll let you say your piece. Or your final piece about this.
What I'll say is this. If you are somebody that, how do I say this? If you're somebody that is hesitant about joining the rallies, if you're somebody that is afraid to speak up, first and foremost, I'm here for you. There are a bunch of people in the immediate area of Greater Boston, as well as onto the North Shore, in Connecticut, in Vermont, and New Hampshire, because I am the Activism Manager for the Israeli American Council of New England. So with that being said, if you are hesitant, I promise you, if you go to one of these rallies and you speak out, especially if you are somebody that's not just hesitant, but are downright scared about what might happen, I promise you, you will feel better because you are going to start doing something. And the worst feeling that everybody has here is the fact that they feel helpless because they think that they can't do something. But you can, Tom, I can, and everybody who understands that this isn't about being anti-Jewish or anti-Israel, it's about being anti-American, and every single person who loves this country can help. I promise you and your entire community exactly that.
Jake, this is the fastest 30 minutes on cable TV, cable access TV. We appreciate you being here. We need to do this all the time, but unfortunately we can't. But again, we had this special edition, and we wanted you to come in, and we thank you for doing so.
Thank you for having me.
And we will have you in again as time permits. Thank you so much.